So, hello everyone. I am thrilled to be here with Alexandria today. Thank you for being here and accepting the invitation.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So, I've discovered your work, I think maybe a year or two on the virtual web of Instagram. And I mean, it's just very impactful for me. And that is why I was super enthusiastic to have you on the show. So, I'm looking forward to explore all of that. But just in case anyone doesn't really know about your journey and where you're from and how you went and discovered yoga, maybe a question, let's turn that way. How would you introduce yourself to someone you just met, for example?
Oh God, depends. Am I introducing myself as a yoga teacher or am I not?
You could.
These days it really depends who you're
Mm,
talking to, whether you want to say that or not. Um, so I'll give you a little background on
yeah.
my journey, at least with practice and teaching. So I've been a student of yoga since I was 20, so that's 25 years. I can't believe I've been doing this for longer than I haven't. That's kind of wild.
Mm.
I've never considered that. So about 25 years ago, when I was still in university, I retired from doing gymnastics, and I don't want people to get me wrong in the sense that I was looking for something to replace gymnastics in the physical sense, because it wasn't. Um, a gymnastics practice becomes almost a ritual and something that is very time consuming and
Mm.
dedicated. And I definitely think in retrospect, that's what I was looking to replace, was that kind of block of time where I was doing something very specific. Um, and so that's when I started, and I did the thing that everybody does where you kind of, have enough money, don't have enough money, practice here or there. And I moved all over the place at that point in my life. And by the time I was 30, I had practiced enough and was interested in yoga really deeply. And I was in a job that I was really bored doing. And I felt like my brain was kind of turning to mush. So I took a teacher training to stimulate my intellect, actually, and to learn more deeply about something I was interested in. And then it happened that that was during the economic crash, the housing collapse. So I got laid off right in the middle, right? It was actually like right before that all kicked off. So I got laid off, and then it was off to the races. And I was one of those things where this was the trajectory I was definitely meant to take, because everything, I'm not saying it wasn't difficult, but everything kind of lined up. And I had a great path forward, and I had people supporting me. And so now here I am. And I started as a teacher that taught very physically and taught, not that I don't teach physicality now, but I taught, very complex poses. I was known to teach fancy, quote unquote, advanced asana. And then I got injured from doing the right thing, from following all of the rules that we're all given. And because I'm, very good student and very coachable from all my years in sport. And then I had to figure out what had happened. And it was actually not something I expected, because I was under the impression yoga was safe and it couldn't hurt you, it was helpful, it was healing in some kind of way. And I do know retrospectively how I got confused given my background. Some of the positions and movements are identical to what you do in gymnastics. And yet in asana, I had no idea that that was going to end in potential injury. And then I figured it out, and I started to see that I wasn't the only one that was hurt, for one. And when I was injured, I couldn't do anything anymore in the way that I could previously. So it meant that I would go to a class and I felt incredibly excluded. There was only like a seniors class, which is great, but I was, 32 at the time. And I left my entire community of practitioners that I was used to, participating with. And it's like, wow, this is kind of miserable when you can't do the status quo. And then I started to see in the student base that I taught how people were left out. And so from there, because one of my guiding principles is that I want to teach everybody on a level playing field that shows up, and I want them to have practice technique that's sustainable for a lifetime, I started to realize I wasn't aligning with that. And so I started to try it more and more. And it was long before those conversations were kind of being had. So I had to forge my own path. And so now I help people grow from one side of the river to the other, from this kind of inaccessible, potentially unsustainable asana practice over to something that's far more inclusive and far more sustainable.
Wow. Thank you so much for, packing all of that. There's a lot to unpack here, but I really appreciate the honesty as well, just sharing, like, I was kind of influencing because of, the sports background and the power dynamic that is just everywhere. Family, school, society, government. So it's kind of easy to fall into the trap in, just following someone else's value and yeah, ideas and projection onto ourselves. And like, maybe they were just so happy to have a student who would be able to achieve these poses, and then pushing you like, yeah, you're doing great. So you're just encapsulating yourself like, I have to do more to satisfy them. And then the risk is there. So where is the self-agency and the self-empowerment in the practice? And that, I feel often very angry and sad about this process because I see it very often as well. So I'm curious how you did navigate maybe the moment that you realized, actually, oh, I went into I love this image of the river. Like, I'm here. How do I go there? And how do I process my emotions, actually?
Yeah, I can absolutely relate to you, this feeling of kind of frustration and anger. And a lot of people have it, especially because I kind of expose in the coursework that I do, I expose this paradigm and all the bits and pieces that people don't see that are causing this like very imbalanced power dynamic, like you mentioned. And one of people's first reactions are just like yours, just like mine, is to be really angry because what they were involved in, they thought was the answer. And I'm not saying that yoga's teachings, these philosophical underpinnings can't be the answer for people, but the methodology is the issue. The practice technique is the obstacle. So I can only say in retrospect how I figured it out, because I didn't know the first two sets of injuries, and I kind of aggravated the same set of injuries 3 times.
Wow.
And it wasn't until the 3rd time that I was like, okay, wait, this is really happening from what I'm doing on a mat. And I can't tinker with it and kind of patch it back up the way a lot of, people do, or what I had figured out, add strength, add stability, add, this, that, or the other. It was still falling apart. And not to mention, even if you could make it kind of safer by doing those things, for the people who could access it, it still was really inaccessible to so many people. I was like, yeah, I could make some people maybe temporarily stronger so they can do the splits, but what about all the people who aren't hypermobile and can't do this?
Yeah.
So I didn't really have a roadmap back then. It was just this kind of inner voice that said, this isn't working. And I'm so puzzle oriented. Like, it's just my personality to want to solve puzzles. And I found it a great challenge. It kept me interested. It was, it still keeps me interested to this day because the landscape's always shifting. So, anybody that thinks that you're going to figure out the exact way to teach and then you're going to do that forever, it's like, no, you're not. Things are going to change. You change along with them. But yeah, that I can really relate. And a lot of people, I think it's really relieving to hear other people are angry too. And you don't stay there necessarily. You have to process through that, right? And it's like, okay, why? And I think what you were saying is so interesting about, and I find it very fascinating. And it's one of the things I like to talk about, is how you give up your agency to this power dynamic and you don't even see you're doing it. And yet, like, look, philosophically, that's what's happening constantly. That's what yoga is trying to teach us, is like, look, you reaffirm the power dynamic that you're used to. You reaffirm the pattern that you're used to. You'll keep doing it until you notice that you're participating in it. Then you can start to pull out where your participation is, where the other person's is, and start to do differently.
Beautiful, like the trap, like really, like you're just repeating the same and the same over and over again, like conditioning, really. Like I don't know if you heard about Krishnamurti. I guess you've heard about him. Like, it's really all about this deconstructing 1 to 3, and really kind of not exploding, but a little bit like taking society the way it is now, like seeing it with truth, authenticity, and even if it hurts, and then what is all the mess going on, and how do we just peel the onion layers off and off and off again and enter really us, like really ourselves. And that's yoga to me. But I agree, like, how is it really, I'm always I'm always curious that we turn a path to free us from freedom into a very painful one. I'm just like, that's crazy. That's mad, really. I'm always shocked and surprised. Mm, yeah.
But I am too. Like, there's that part of me that's like, oh my gosh, why does this happen?
Yeah.
But the more I understand how conditioning works and how the survival instinct works and how the portion of the brain that it controls survival and is responsible for survival historically. I was listening to a psychologist speak about how, oftentimes we think, oh, it's like our higher intellect that's the best part of our brain, or the smartest part, and blah, blah, blah. And, the fastest part. No, it's not. The survival portions are the fastest, smartest, most efficient portions of the brain. And they're vital, because if they weren't, you wouldn't be here. Like, I wouldn't be here. They're what's kept every one of our ancestors alive and propagating in the past. So to think we're going to override that somehow, quickly, or even like really at all. And so anything that's become, that you've been conditioned to survive in the past, no matter how, it could be survived great, survived miserable, but if you've survived it, then it. And so you stick to it rather than moving into entropy and the unknown. Entropy is chaos. So of course we just take this, liberation path and then run it through our framework that we already have, and avoid everything that is different, because that meant potential death historically, and that's that. So it's like,
definitely. I
repeat.
so appreciate like the bridging, really. Like I'm so passionate about psychology. I've studied it a little bit, and I'm really focusing on trauma and trauma resolution, obviously, and how yoga helps us navigate the self-agency reclaiming process again. And I'm just like, yeah, I've never that it is actually the same process itself. Like, how is it that an industry in a very large scale fell into the same pattern? Well, because it's what we do. Like, it's so simple. So thank you to name that. I'm just like, yeah, it's crystal clear, right? So my intellect once again was like, yeah, maybe there is a deeper reason. I'm like, well, not really. Well, a deeper, yes, but in your brain, that's just a neural pathway. Like, don't freak out. So yeah, that's interesting. I love that. That's exactly how I feel when I see your post. I'm like, you're encapsulating many things that I can imagine and feel, and just in 2 phrases, and I'm like, ooh, well done. Like, that's
I've been at
brilliant.
it for a while, trying to find all the pieces, and I'm like, okay. I keep saying to people, I'm like, I haven't found a lot of new pieces lately. I found new ways to describe the same pieces, but not new ones. I've got like the puzzle pretty solved, but it's just really funny to watch the repetition happen, from, everybody. It's not like I'm free of that somehow, but it's very funny to watch, like on a broad scale. Every time like a yoga trend comes up, I'm like, there it is, repeating itself again. It's not, that's going to go the wrong direction, but all right, go ahead.
Yeah, so true. You definitely, like, just witnessing it, like, oh, okay, interesting. Just noting it, like, I can see that repeating again and again. And like you could taking the image again, like you could observing from the other side of the river, like, hey guys, I see you. I'm here. I'm grounding into my own vision and understanding of yoga, and yet I see you. So that's something that I've been discussing with Jivana Heyman. Maybe you've heard about him as well, like running the Yoga Accessible organization. And he was like, yeah, I feel your anger. And like we said, I understand. And yet it's, again, division and separation to kind of, quote unquote, fight the other side of the river. And for now, I'm here. I mean, I'm all into fighting and like treating them like, this is not yoga, this is bad. And like, I'm like, well, maybe, okay, that's where I'm at. But I'm curious if you are, where are you in the process yourself right now?
Very similar to that endpoint of like, when you get frustrated about something and you go through that process of anger, then it seems to shift into that place of, now I know better and I want everybody else to be where I am immediately. And you kind of become an evangelist in a certain way. And then there's that othering, right? Because now you think you're right and they're wrong. But like you were saying with the river, I was standing on the other side before. It's not like I just was birthed on the side that I'm on now, or standing where I am with the vantage point. It's not even a side. It's like a vantage point. I didn't come with that vantage point. I learned that vantage point over time. So I try to I don't even have to necessarily try anymore, because I just understand that people are doing the best they can with what information and what experience I have at any given time. There are things that lead away from yoga's trajectory, and there are things that lead towards it. Some of the things that lead towards it take longer than others, and they're kind of like a very windy path. And then there's kind of more of a straight shot, and it really depends on the individual which one they take because of their conditioning. So I don't fight anyone any longer. I say, like, hey, have you considered this? Have you looked at it from this angle? Because that's all I can do from where I'm standing, to invite other people to know there's a wider vantage point that they could take, or a different one that they could take. But if they want to keep putting their foot behind their head, then put your foot behind your head. Like, I'm not going to stop you. And I also don't begrudge you for it. I'm just not going to do that. So as long as there's a two-way street, which that's the hard part, because sometimes it's like, well, no, you don't get to say all of that, but I get to keep doing what I'm doing. And I'm like, well, I mean, you can also do that, but I mean, I'm going to reserve the right to say what I'm saying and do what I do if you are going to retain the same. So now I'm very, because it's required, right? If we're angry, it's usually about something we were involved in that kind of way, with something like this, right? Like, you're angry at how gullible you were, how naive you were, what you bought into. Very old, right? That's a very old thing that's related to. So then it becomes, okay, let me look at myself instead of looking outwards at other people and projecting it. Let me look at myself. And then you realize that if you're angry and projecting it out on other people, you're really just angry at yourself still in this kind of scenario. And sure, I'm not saying I'm not frustrated by what some people are doing still, but I'm not God. I don't get that kind of ability. So I always try to point the finger back at myself, and instead of getting angry or going after people or any of that, which I just don't have the energy for or care to do at all. I'm like, it's what they're doing right now. It's what I was doing when I was doing that sort of thing. And there was no telling me or arguing with me, one way or the other, that it was wrong. I had to come to that conclusion over time. So that's kind of where I sit now. Is like, people are doing the best they can. And a lot of people don't have enough information. So how could they do better?
Yeah, definitely. When you don't know, you don't know. Like, it's up to us to invite, as you said, like more a broader way of perceiving and understanding and embodying yoga as well. So what I hear is about compassion towards them, but also toward parts of yourself, and also who you were, and just self-compassion as well. Like, yeah, I feel you. I feel the anger, but it's also maybe shadow work, like, oh, maybe there's something that I don't appreciate on myself. And I'm talking about me right now, like, maybe, yeah, like just owning, as you said, like, I've been there. And then now how do we come together, if they want to, or at least how do I come together with all the parts of me and all the things that I still don't appreciate, and keep going on in the way that I want to. So yeah, beautiful.
Yeah, because otherwise you do create this division, right? It's like an us versus them, but that's what started it in the first place, is this division. So I think it's really important to remember that, just remembering, right? That's, don't erase my past or, delete old things. I'm like, no, that's who I was at that time. That's the way I am now.
Yeah.
I'm not pretend that I wasn't that, or that it was bad. It was what I was doing, the thing I was told to do. We're all doing the thing we were told to do by somebody we trusted.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, totally. But no black and white thinking anymore, and just more inclusion and soothing, I guess. Like that's really what yoga offers, I guess. Like, how do we navigate the paradoxes and the difficulties, and like, oh, it's huge and it's difficult to handle the contraries, but guess what? That's what yoga teaches us. So that's a good point. Yeah, it can help us, definitely. Yeah. And I'm curious.
Sit in the gray area.
Yeah.
It's so hard, right? Like, we want, because that's survival. Survival is good, bad, safe, dangerous, like all this. And so you're fighting that part of saying, well, it depends. You can't say it depends with a bear, right?
Definitely.
Even though, if you wanted to get into the land of theory or anything,
we could.
Sure, it depends, but also odds are it's dangerous. So we can't interpret everything that way in life. It's not everything is a bear or a tiger.
Totally.
You know?
Yeah. And this is exactly how we exit the survival mode and the conditioning mode, like just stepping back, like, hey, truthfully, here there is no palpable danger, so I can raise my awareness into the present moment. I can be yoga more and then choose really, like, is this something that I want to repeat? And okay, or is there another way, another path? And how can I explore that and become someone new, or maybe a lot of integration as well in the process. So yeah,
Right. Yeah.
totally. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then using the intellect in that way. So, but to do that, once again, we also need regulation and nervous system appeasement. And once again, this is where yoga enters the game. So just like the key is yoga, right?
Yeah.
Like,
Well, that's the thing, right? Like you can try to think yourself out of that place, but if your nervous system's already registered that you're under threat, right? Then you can't flip the switch to turn the part of your brain on that holds the intellect, that allows you to engage in that way. It takes minutes, long minutes, and it has to feel safe, and you have to do, technique to actually get yourself out of that place. So, this it's easier said than done, and it's really uncomfortable work, even when you're in a place of ease, right? Your nervous system still wants to draw you towards that which is predictable. And it's, if any of you, all of us that have done that kind of work where you try to go the other direction, my God, it's really hard.
Yeah.
And it can feel painful, even though it's really just uncomfortable. It's not actual pain. It just feels, that physical feeling of pain is like internal emotional pain can be there to go a different direction for sure.
Yeah, it's perceived as threat and dangerous. Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
And I'm curious about what you said at the very beginning about the fact that after the gymnastics, yoga became kind of your sacred moment, and a very long moment when you could be with yourself really and be in motion, maybe, I guess, at the time, and just spending time in your physicality and mental space and emotional space. And I'm curious if now the practice itself that you have about yoga changed, and how is it right now? How does it look like?
Well, now it's more that in truth, the swap, I don't want to say that gymnastics is anything to do with yoga, although, to be totally honest, the day in, day out of it, the repetition, the doing what's uncomfortable sometimes, like that it has some overlaps, although I would not call it yoga at all. But it was very physical and very much about, you turn off your emotion when you're doing that, except for, supporting your teammates and whatever. You can't be emotional about it in full. Of course, you cry when you get hurt, and you cry when you can't do something, like there's all that, but you're really trying to separate out this, performance ability from emotion and from intellect, because you can't think either. So I was looking for something that, kept my intellect busy and allowed me to focus on a task. The problem with that, which is why I leaned into alignment, right? Ashtanga combined with alignment was, of course, what I love. It's got this physicality that's very familiar to me and very predictable, combined with this heavy intellectual activity of precision. Oh boy, did I love that. But what does it do? You tune out from feel. There's no feeling involved in that. You're not processing emotion. You're in fact, you're diverting your attention away from that, So of course, that's what people who, there's lots of people, perfectionists love that kind of thing, right? Which, of course, that definitely describes me historically, and control freaks and people like that. They love that sort of thing. So it actually took a long time to realize that it was that emotional, somatic component that was really missing. I was pulling everything up into the mind and not feeling either physically or emotionally anything else. But when I couldn't do asana anymore, that was the part that it started to show up. It's, I couldn't, at points I couldn't walk really at all. Like the nerve pain was pretty significant. So at a certain point, all I could do was lay on the floor in constructive rest. That was it. Wow. That's all I could do. And it was wild how that started helping. And just being there, being quiet, feeling myself on the ground, listening to the sounds around me started to make this big change. And I was like, this is so weird. How is my body feeling better from doing nothing? And the more I was learning about the nervous system and about trauma, and I was like, oh, of course. Okay, this is why. Exactly. So what does it look like now? Like I lay on the floor. It doesn't look like anything, really. I do a lot of laying on the floor, a lot of, kind of pandiculation work that I wouldn't inherently call part of my yoga practice because I'm not being guided in it. I'm intellectualizing it for a specific aim. But I use a lot of that kind of technique in how I teach for feel, notice, make choice. But it's a lot of just kind of really quiet laying around sort of work, and anything that's exercise is just totally separate. Like that's not, I don't combine the two together because I don't know how I feel about whether I think it's possible. I'm sure some people can combine the two together. And I'm not saying that practices that I teach are not physical. They can be, and they can be challenging and hard, but they don't look the same. They don't carry the same poses or positions or things like that. But from my past, it's very hard to separate out, physical demand, and to get a yoga practice to happen, because the conditioning is so strong to go in that, gymnastics isn't fitness, but that physicality and that effort. And I'm so good at that. I can do that all day without thinking about it and make myself suffer. So it's much harder for my personality and my history to be quiet, to not have to be perfect, to just feel instead of insisting something look a certain way. So that's the type of thing I tend to do, that and study into the teachings themselves. Like I spend a tremendous amount of time doing that, which qualifies for everybody who's confused. Study into the teachings, study of the self within the context of these teachings, not self-study like I'm doing whatever I feel like doing, but studying the idea of the self is part of it, right? Like that counts as practice. So that's kind of what it looks like these days. People are just like, what does it look like? Take it. Not that you were saying that, but they're like, could you post a video? I'm like, what do you want to see me laying on the floor or like
just pushing the wall? Like, what do you want? Yeah. And I really like when you were talking, I was like, oh, I realized that this is my own bias. Like, I'm just like, why the question, how does it look like? Because my own self still, I'm just combining both. Like it has to look a certain way for me, still like a part of me to be yoga. And still like what I teach is the opposite. So I'm like, interesting, there's something there. So yeah, I appreciate that. Like, how does it feel actually, and how do you embody it in your daily life, really? And that's what I hear. So thank you for that. Yeah.
Of course, because that's the interesting thing, right? If you really think about it, can you see yoga from the outside? Nope.
Yeah.
Not at all. So how it looks is completely irrelevant. But then you get into what are we all taught in teacher training as yoga? Well, we're taught, some teacher trainings do teach what yoga's concepts are from a philosophical, textual standpoint. But then the word yoga is the same word we use to describe the practice technique. So they become synonymous. So, and a lot of teacher trainings don't teach as much of that philosophical underpinning. So then the yoga is just the poses, and you start to deconstruct that. Then what are you left with? Like, where did the yoga go? And then for teachers, especially, you deconstruct that all the way down. How do you teach if you don't have the poses? But that's such an interesting place to be, because it's not about the poses. They were supposed to be a vehicle, a means to an end. And yet everybody's so hung up on recreating the way things look. That's why I'm very insistent about like, okay, you want to make things really accessible. Stop making it look like what you think it should look like. Try thinking outside of the box, because if trying to make it look a certain way, that runs into a limitation at a point. For sure.
And in the same circle, like it doesn't change it and doesn't evolve the conversation around yoga. So I appreciate the pose. That was one of the most impactful. Like if we were to just ignore poses for a moment, how would you teach? And I've been sitting with it like for maybe a week or so, because I knew we were recording the episodes. I was like, oh shit, like this is really, really intense. Like I don't know, like I know, and yet I don't know. I'm just like, it's so interesting. So that's great material. So thank you for that. I just felt it. Yeah, it was good.
Yeah, that's a place where that's a question. I suppose it came from how I was trained, because the teacher that taught me was highly adaptable in a way, right? So it was just an idea that I took forward, where what I was told was, you need to learn what yoga is, what the tools are to move you towards that, what the obstacles are that move you away from that. These very old teachings, learn that part. as long as what you're doing in a practice, when you're either practicing or teaching, asks people to directly engage with those concepts, then it's yoga.
Yeah.
Worry about what it is or what it looks like. You're asking people to engage with what it is, what it isn't, and how they, fall out and into a trap, or how they get back in, all the little bits and pieces. So I was empowered to really start adapting from that place, but that was the idea that was underpinning it. And at first I started, I call it pose saving, where you kind of try to patch the poses up, you tinker with little bits and pieces. You kind of put, I don't know if in France if it's spackle, but it's like plaster where you fill a hole in the wall, with temporary plaster, just that, but then the crack shows back up because it's the foundation broken, not just the wall.
Yeah.
I was like, God, this keeps falling apart. It's falling apart. And finally I was like, I got to stop trying to save the look of these things and the position of them and all that. What am I trying to teach? Where's this philosophical part, which was always driving it, but I just went there really heavy over time. And then it becomes something that just looks really different. And you don't have to save all of those shapes. And yeah, I'm not suggesting that anybody go from teaching poses to not teaching poses overnight. No, it's work. And your students will freak out and you'll freak out because that's entropy, that's chaos, that's the unknown. Your nervous system's not like that. But little by little, if you can let that concept, how would I teach? How would I teach yoga, which is purely conceptual, without poses? I'm not saying without physicality, I'm saying without poses.
Poses, yeah.
Could you do it? If the answer is no, there's so much room there. Lean into that. And when you find yourself trying to hold tight to the way something looks, the position of it, ask yourself why. What would it be like to let that fall apart? And you start to realize, like, oh, I'm gripping to the known because it's safe. Even when it's me or hurting other people, it's known. Okay, what would it be like? Step into the unknown. Let's see.
And how yoga philosophy helps us, again, navigate the unknown and the kind of changing and transformative process. Yes, totally. Yeah,
It's like you're trying to control the whole thing, Arjuna. You want to control the outcome of this sport that's about to happen. You don't get to have that say, my friend.
Totally. That's so true. Yeah, that's very powerful. Like, how do we infuse the philosophy itself in the process, even as a teacher and as anybody, really? Like, you don't have to be teaching or practicing poses to be a yoga practitioner, and that's also very expensive and opening. So I'm glad to mention that too. So it's, how can we, like, what I had the image of an equation, like math, really, like, how do we remove something that is just blocking the results? Like, where do you want to go and how do we go there? And maybe it's hard. You feel resistance. Then what's resistant in the yoga philosophy, and what is the harmful behavior that you've attached to the result? And then how can you soothe yourself or ask for help as well? Like, maybe therapy is yoga. I don't know. Like, where's the limit? I mean, I've been practicing somatic experiencing for maybe 2 years or so. Like, to me, that's yoga. Pendulation, like just being with emotions. Like, that's exactly where I find the meeting point without the poses, really. So maybe,
it can be so many different things. And it always comes back to intent with me, like, where if you had to pull it apart and explain how that particular technique or experiential option that you were giving people ties back to what yoga is about. If you can do that, no big deal. Like you were saying, pendiculation, but that's a change in muscle tone, right? It's a change in how the patterning of the muscle fires. If you're doing it for that specific aim to change the patterning of the muscle, then that's, to that aim. It's not yoga inherently. But if you're utilizing it as a means of exploration in the moment and processing, being with and feeling how that feels physically and otherwise, that's a really different thing. And watching your attachment and, you label things as like, well, that's weird. That should change. I want to fix that. It's like, why are you trying to fix it? Just let it be what it is right now. That part is so important, instead of this, it has to look a certain way or it has to be a certain way. Oh, come on, let it be whatever it needs to be. And I think one thing that popped up when you were speaking, so much of what we've been taught to use as a teaching methodology isn't teaching methodology. We're teaching people how to perform or how to make their body look a certain way or do a certain thing. But that's not how you teach in a teaching setting. Can you imagine in a, a writing class. If the teacher stood at the board and wrote a paragraph and said, that's how you do it. There's no structure in that. There's no grammar. There's no broader concept. There's nothing. So then they just make you mimic it. And it's like, there, now you know how to do a paragraph and write a paragraph. It's like, no, you don't. You know how to emulate the look of a paragraph, but you don't know how to actually create one for yourself. So that's why knowing what yoga is about, this philosophical, spiritual underpinnings, that's the part that needs to be understood. Because then let's take something simple that, people talk about all the time, like truthfulness, right? And one of the yamas. Okay, fine. Well, you can say that, be truthful, while people are holding chair pose or whatever it is that you're utilizing, but that doesn't get them to understand what is truth, what is not truth. How do they relate to both of those? And where do they lean into a lack of truth or manipulation versus honesty, interpretation of the present as it is? So you've got to develop ways to go, okay, which is which? This is the one we're aiming towards. This is the one you're inclined towards, but we want this one over here. So, okay, let's play with that. That's why I can sound to people like I'm so far off in some other planet. And I'm like, no, because that's where the best place to go to do exactly what I'm saying is change the practice technique that you utilize right now. That process provides every single bit of, manipulation, all the things you opened this with, all that pattern exists in exactly how we teach. Okay, now find the truth of any one of those poses or positions. See where it's exclusive, see where it's injurious, show people in practice, in physical exploration, why those poses don't work that way, how they might be injurious, then show them that pose rebuilt or that position rebuilt in a way that would work and would be sustainable and it's individualized, and then get them to compare and contrast. And you're like, oh, you thought it was this way, but it's actually this way. Oh, look at you. You want to pin your feet together in Tadasana. You want to point them straight ahead. And the adaptation to that is the world's going to fall apart. Well, come on. Before you knew we were doing Tadasana, you were just exploring different foot positioning and you were trying to investigate what would feel stable for you. What would feel, I wouldn't call it mountain yet because you're going to set off that predictability thing.
Exactly.
But just describe a mountain without saying mountain. And you decided, oh, your feet had to be wider or asymmetrical or angled or whatever it is. Now I called it Tadasana. Now I said Samastitihi and you're all pinned in. Oh, come on. What's the truth of the situation? What's dishonest? Does that really pinned in like that? You're telling me if you were getting rocked around on a boat, you'd be standing with your feet all pinned together? No,
of course.
Yeah, exactly. So there's this opportunity to look at how teaching works, how you impart it to other people and how you get them to embody it so that they can replicate the concept for themselves without, over time, you needing to do it for them in any kind of way.
Definitely, like giving them the tools to embody yoga and to see from the yogic perspective how they walk or how they talk or the space before entering the conflict. Like, ooh, like we said at the beginning, I'm just repeating the same conflict pattern. Like, do I have space? No. Okay, I'm just right into it. And then when I will shower, I was like, oh, I should have said that. Well, okay, that's yoga too. Like, how can you take it and use it, quote unquote, or really explore it in anything that you are doing. And like I really appreciate what you said. I really saw the vehicle, like the body being a vehicle for yoga, really, and not the opposite. Like not yoga being a goal for the body to look or feel or achieve whatever. And that's really beautiful to me. And I'm just feeling selfishly like confirmed. I'm like, yeah, this is exactly what we are trying to explore in the classes. So I'm like, well, good job. But that's fun because I've been maybe teaching for 4 years or something. Well, COVID happened, but anyway, like in between. And now I'm really savoring Tantra philosophy as well. And I'm like, oh, that's another realm as well. And how can we once again, like I really see the common points between Patanjali, which is a dualistic philosophy, but still, like I don't really see, well, I see, but still I see really the common points with Tantra as well. So I'm like, well, yoga with a big, letters. So how do we go from there into everyday lives? And that's also where cultural appropriation and the limit between that and adapting as well. Like I'm always questioning myself about that. But yeah, I introduce a lot of somatic practices, for example, body mind centering. I don't know if you've heard about that practice. So it's really studying the anatomy and then moving freely from it. And I'm like, well, to me, that's exploration of the self, from the self into the body. So that's yoga, right? So like, how do I respect the tradition, being a white woman as well, and yet do I remain authentic to my interests and values? So the limit is quite fragile sometimes.
And it is, and I think to admit that is useful and uncomfortable, but that's where the good stuff lies. But that's why I'm so, you know, I've got two kind of tracks that I teach and that I kind of be, you know, very like tangible physical component, because that's going to be the means to the end. That's going to be a tool I've got to understand and know how to use really well. And I've got to know the diversity in different bodies and different experiences. And that's always a learning process. And then I've got this philosophical lane, this spiritual teachings lane. They work together, but they're both necessary. And so I always look at, okay, are you leaning into understanding what yoga is? What are these teachings? Where did they come from? You know, when you start looking at all of the different ones, like you were saying, there's a tremendous amount of overlap. Then there's human beings that keep reinterpreting these things through different systems, right? So depends on who's interpreted one of these texts, whether it's going to have this more dualistic or non-dualistic lean to it, because it's no different than, and I'm not saying the Bible has anything to do with this. I'm just saying we all are fairly familiar with the Bible, and we know over time there's different, there's tons of different Christian systems that use the same book, right? But they're all coming from a different angle and interpreting that. So I'm always like, okay, go back to the teachings, make sure that you're getting those teachings from somebody who knows what they are, from somebody who's really invested in them, from somebody who's not slanting them, you know, any more than anybody does, because we're all biased in our own, you know, way, but where they're not adding, you know, new age jumbo, or they're not just, you know, mixing different systems together of like, you know, different spiritual systems. And I'm not saying different spiritual systems don't have overlap, but I like to respect the one that I'm in at any given time. So if you're leaning into that and you lean into it more and you love it, right? And you're invested in it, then that physical component is just a utility to teach that stuff. Because how do you teach something that's purely esoteric and, you know, conceptual, except for having some kind of physical way to process it and engage with it? Because you can intellectualize it all you want, which this is even talked about in the teachings, right? Like you can come to this through intellect, or you can come to it through, sometimes it's just spontaneous, sometimes it happens through some kind of like investigative practice sort of thing. Okay, well, there's different means to an end. So you're going to need that part. We can't just, you know, navel gaze the entire time about the concepts, but you have to lean into those. And that's why when you know that, when you know what those teachings are, and you know how invested you are in them, then you don't, there's no need to be upset about changing the way, like the poses themselves or things like that you teach through, because you can, I'm always like, if I was in front of a grand jury, or if I had to, I was on a debate stage and I had to defend my case of why I teach the physical practice so differently, I could defend it, and I continue to try to defend it better and to learn more about the teachings themselves, so that the practice I'm teaching reflects and asks people to engage with it in this very respectful way. So that's where I'm always leaning people, is like, can you explain how the thing you're doing ties back to this set of teachings? Because if so, then don't worry about changing it. If you can't, then lean into the philosophy part. And I think what you're saying was so, it leans at, I'm not saying this was your position at all, but I think for the yoga world, it's so worth saying. Some people aren't interested in yoga, and that's okay. Sometimes people got into yoga because they thought it was one thing. And over time, as they've learned what it's really about, or when they learn about the teachings themselves, they're like, I'm not so into that, but I really like the idea of, you know, maybe PT or direct trauma work, or things like there's some other lane. And I'm like, cool, that's amazing. Or your fitness or strength training. I don't know. There's lots of other lanes people tend to be more interested in. And I'm like, then come on, use your yoga tools, be honest. Maybe you let the name yoga go at that point, and you lean in the direction that you really want to go and that really intrigues you, because from the sounds of what you're saying, you're really intrigued by these teachings. I am too. This is where my path lies. It's just part of like how I see the world and what I really care about. I can't walk a different, I couldn't if I tried. I can't. It's always how I frame things. So you know, if that's the case, then lean that direction. And if you're not sure yet, experiment in that direction. But at a certain, I think it's worth saying some people just, you know, and that's great. It's totally fine. You don't have to teach yoga or practice it.
Yeah, totally. It's also free to explore a new path, and again, yeah, to be true to yourself again. So how do you pivot from the teachings themselves into your own journey as a human being as well? Like just removing the tag like yoga teacher, but as a self, who are you? Like, is it really what is true to yourself or not? Then you can just choose and assume it as well. So own it. So that's beautiful too. Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's really big questionings as well, and like widening the perspective, and how do we name yoga, and when you said like you don't have to use the name yoga, and I'm like, ooh, and that's look back to the anger I could feel sometimes, like when I judge something that isn't yoga to me and still is named yoga, and I'm like, ooh, like how do I position myself as a business owner as well, and as someone who has to feed herself, and being true to the teachings, and like feeling that I am really doing something that is right for me, and not saying that they have to do it like we said, and still like how do I combine being true to myself and still just exploring an industry that is quote unquote not really fair or balanced. So I'm curious about how you position yourself as well.
Yeah, I share a similar feeling, and I'm not going to, I am no saint in a certain way, in the sense of like, I still stand by that. There are things that I'm like, that's not yoga. I'm sorry. It's just not. You can't tell me that. I just saw one the other day that I was like, oh, I thought we were doing like the wine and the drinking after practicing. This was on the mat, drinking on the mat. Well, I was like, oh, okay. I mean, I don't like what, I can't even really thoroughly get, but I don't like the combining of alcohol and I'm if you want to drink, I don't care at all. But the combining of the two gets very weird, and I get that people do it for, it's a gimmick, right? It's a way to get people in the door, which to me is very weird. I just am like, I get that it's a business, but I don't know that you should get them in the door with something that, you know, is kind of in opposition to, I'm not saying don't drink, but like when drinking is the, like I get to have wine after,
definitely.
it's a weird power dynamic and a weird relationship to substance when we're talking about yoga. But then on the mat, I was like, yes, that's like, how is that a yoga practice in any way, shape, or form? I stand by, like, sometimes I'm like, no, I'm sorry, not that. That's discernment, right? That's it's viveka. That's actually a necessary component, is to be able to say, no, not that, this. So there are things that I don't mind saying, like, no, I don't think that's that. Now, do I think that somebody could have a spontaneous, let's say goat yoga, right? Like somebody could have a spontaneous experience with goat yoga, where they're having a spontaneous absorption with, you know, what yoga is in the moment. Sure. Do I think it happened because they did Warrior 2 with goats jumping on it? No, it was happenstance that it happened there. And that's just another kind of like gimmick sort of thing. So I always look at what I'm offering in a business sense. Am I solving a problem that already exists that leads people more clearly and more directly towards yoga, and does it in a way that honors their individual body and their individual life? Or am I doing this to hook people, or to kind of get them in the door, or to give them what they want, while then, you know, kind of giving them what they need on the back end? And I don't like any of those things these days. I did that stuff because that's where I started. So I used to, you know, teach handstand workshops and arm workshops. The thing that was funny is over time, they didn't end up doing those poses in the workshops. I was showing them why they did work and who they were exclusive to and who that was going to get injured, and, you know, all these steps they'd have to take before even approaching that sort of thing to, you know, build the stability, the awareness, all this, if they were even hypermobile and could do it, like all that. So then it was kind of like a weird advertising thing where, they're advertising arm balances. There's a picture of an arm balance, and then they come and I show them like why arm balances doesn't work. Like they won't work. So I stopped doing that. I stopped offering workshops on those topics because I can't square them anymore. And people are getting annoyed that, they're not getting what they want. And I'm not someone, this goes back to what we were saying earlier. I'm not going to stop anyone from teaching those kinds of workshops. I'm not going to say anything about it. I'm just not teaching them. There's tons of them. If people want to go and learn that stuff, there is gobs of it out there for them to get involved with. What there isn't a lot of is the alternative. What there isn't a lot of is things for people who can't do those sorts of things and don't want to do those sorts of things, or used to and don't want to anymore. Teachers that are bored of that sort of thing and want to go further in their practice. Like that's missing. So that's where I am. Why not offer that? So I'm always like, okay, are you doing it to bolster your own ego? Like, is what you're offering because you want to be seen as good or popular, or you might make people happy? Because that's worth reflecting on. That's probably not a great direction to go. Are you doing it because it's authentic to where you are right now? It's what's needed out there and missing in some kind of way. Do you have the solution to a problem that exists? Go that direction. That's the way that is, it feels great because it's authentic. And it's true and it's honest and it's what's needed and it's in the moment. But so it does that also is helpful. It's missing. So, you're offering something that a lot of people
could
maybe
benefit
not
from.
as many, but they benefit, right?
Totally. And that's what you're doing, right? Like with your upcoming course, isn't it?
Yeah, it's what both of them are. All of them, they lean to solve those things in one way or the other, because it's like that's missing. People don't have access to. One of the things that, yes, there's philosophy courses out there and study, of course, there's great ones, but my goodness, they're hard for people to find, and everybody resonates a little bit differently. And how people describe things is different. What metaphor they use, what real life relationship they create with a certain, that can be different. So, but I think it's, going back to what you were saying about cultural appropriation, people have a real desire to not do that, right? That's a much bigger conversation than it was maybe even 3, 4, 5 years ago. But it's really difficult because people that want to do better, they're like, I'm in the middle of, such and such area, and there aren't any teachers teaching that here directly. And I can't find that. So that's why I'm like, okay, I'm going to provide that thing that's missing online. And also I traveled a ton, and I asked every single Friday night workshop for all those years of travel, whether they'd studied the Gita, whether they'd studied the sutra, whether they had understanding of it, whether they were applying it. And what I found was, by and large, bits and pieces of each text at best. There'd be a couple people who'd studied them in full, but very few. And these are mostly teachers, right? So it was missing. And I was like, my goodness, that's not my background at all. Like, I had this very unique experience of deep study into that and continuous study. Okay, well, how can I expect them to know what yoga is? And how can we expect the yoga world to do any better and to not appropriate if they don't know what yoga is and what the teachings are? So I just started offering that. And then in addition, I don't know how you feel, but so many people shared that they no longer have this community practice component. They don't go to studios anymore. Or if they do, there's only like one teacher that they really resonate with anymore. So they practice alone. And one of the things that people say they went to a yoga practice for that is almost universal is community, some kind of group connection. And so many people have lost that, or it's not even they can't find a class they like. They want to do something further. They want to dive more deeply into something. And so I was like, okay, let's do that. Let's have community practice in addition to philosophy study. Let's have a discussion group, and we'll do it in a way that's, what you're missing in your community. Let me provide that. And it's worked really well. People come out at the end of that yoga student training course, having made it all the way through both of those texts 3 times over. We do it once full over the whole year, an intro all the way through at the beginning, and a close up all the way through each one at the end. And then a year of discussion and application and inquiry and physical, map practice in one way or the other. And it's they know what yoga is at the end from those two texts standpoint. They also know other interpretations historically in certain ways, but they know how they overlap, and they know the concepts within, and they can see it in their lives. And it's really wonderful to see where they're like, yeah, now I understand, and I don't have to repeat those patterns, and I know why this practice technique might. It's very cool. So I'm always like, look for that stuff. Even if it's you don't teach something fancy, but you know why it doesn't work. Teach people why it doesn't work, for crying out loud.
Yeah, definitely.
And shoving it to the side. And why? They want to know why. Then they will go to a class and repeat that sort of thing. There's so many things people can be offering that there's very little access to.
And the collaboration, I appreciate that as well. Like what I can hear from the course itself, like you and them, like collaborating together to study it and asking questions. And I guess maybe you've been surprised as well, like, oh, I never thought about it that way, like yourself as a teacher's teacher. So that's fun too, to dive into it and endlessly being a student of life and yoga itself. So that's very humble, and that's quite yogic to me. So I appreciate that too. Yeah,
because all of these teachings are cyclical, right? Like I can't tell you how many times I've made my way through each one of these texts, hundreds at this point. And every single time I come out the end of one of these groups, because I run 2 a year. So I'm making my way through, every 6 months I'm starting again. And at the end of every 6 months, I'm like, wow, that's a furtherance. That's a different perspective. That's, this worked for this particular group. Let's, add that to this next group. This didn't work so much when we refined it this way, like it worked better. So it's that constant learning, and then remembering and forgetting and remembering and forgetting. And you go further and further forward as you go. But that's why I'm always like, you're not done just because you made it through one of those texts once, that's not enough. This is a constant revisiting, and then look at it from lots of angles, compare and contrast lots of teachings. Like I love what you were saying about looking at tantric philosophy, because I love looking at Buddhism and looking at all these different angles, because then you see the commonality and you see the difference, and you can really, it's like running a meta study, right?
Totally.
Where you meta-analysis all these things and see all these common points. And I'm like, those common points are where the good stuff is. That's where they're on to something. And
the
then,
essence of it.
And then you can really start to apply it when the pieces aren't so disparate, right?
I guess we share the same kind of brain structure, right? Like the map one. Like, oh, let me step back for a while. Like, let's integrate all of it. And that's what I really feel that is attracted into yoga. This is really a whole practice and an integrative practice as well. Like both the physicality, of course, and the philosophy is a huge technology itself. And that's really beautiful that we can enter it from many, many different points. So in itself, yoga is accessible. So that's quite hopeful to me as well. And I appreciate that you can just do a course only on philosophy, and this is really happening, and twice a year. So that's beautiful. I mean, that's great. And I will link the website in the bio as well, so everyone can find it, because it's starting in May, right? In the end of the
next group starts in May. And so but it's really, it's funny because people are like, oh, people don't want that. I'm like, yes, they do. They want it to be applicable. They want to understand it. They don't want to be preached at in some kind of way. And not to say that it's, not that I'm in any way watering it down or whitewashing it. No. But you've got to create common ground and explain things in realistic terms to people, while also teaching what this means, in full, and not eliminating pieces because they're inconvenient. Like that, the people really love it. And it's kind of wild, because it's like, oh, they only want to do, poses, or they only want to learn about anatomy. And I'm like, no, they just don't have an access point for this sort of thing. And a lot of people are like, well, I tried to read it, but I'm like, that's because it's not meant to be taken in that way, especially without guide. Like you can't, these were oral tradition. They were passed on through that listening and integrating process. And then in addition, through teacher-student relationship, and then through practice technique. So reading it just is very hard to take it in and apply in any kind of real way. So
that's a living practice.
I wanted to do it forever. It's very, very rewarding in a way that I couldn't have expected.
I appreciate that. And the fact that it's also a lot of beliefs around what people expect from yoga even as teachers, like you said, but they only want that. Are you really sure? Like, can
Yeah.
you offer something new? And let's see, like maybe yes, but maybe no. So that's beautiful as well. And I guess I believe that we also attract where people are in coherence and in resonance with where we are ourselves. As you
Absolutely.
said, with the lecture itself, like with any book, like you can read it 1,000 times in your entire life, like it will always just land differently according to what you're experiencing right now. So it's they are tools, they are navigating tools, like a map on your car, really. So, but let's not
Yeah.
talk about cars, but
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a whole process.
Yeah.
It never ends. And
Yeah.
yeah, you really do resonate with the people that are ready to hear that. But I'm always, of this mind, like you were saying, oh, they don't want that. How do you know?
Yeah.
And I always think it's funny. I'm like, have you ever tried? They might not want it because they don't know what it is. And they've never
Mm,
you know what you want if you've never seen what's possible. Is this,
definitely.
oh, I want it to be a huge success overnight, right? And
Mm,
then I think people forget that for, I said at the beginning, it's 25 years. Yoga classes weren't packed with
yeah.
people back then. There
Mm,
was a handful of people in any given class.
mm,
Yoga it's a dissonant path. It's a different path. It's against human nature in a certain way.
mm,
Like it's for human nature, but it's
yeah.
work with it better.
Against
But
conditioning. Yeah.
yeah, it's
Yeah.
against the conditioning we're all in. So it's uncomfortable and
Yeah.
it's difficult, and not everybody wants to do it. If everybody
Mm,
wanted to do it, not that yoga is therapy directly, but like everybody would be on a therapist's couch 7 days a week then.
yeah.
And they're not, because people don't want to do that kind of work. They're
Yeah.
more comfortable living the miserable, predictable thing they've been doing than to do the
Mm,
uncomfortable work of finding an alternative.
mm,
So I'm like, it's going to take time, because back then those classes were tiny and now there's more. But I'm also like, be aware of the limits. You're
yeah.
not teaching something that was meant to be broadly popular. If it
Mm,
was, it would be without all the flash and gimmick and all of those sorts of things.
yeah.
But take the time to build it. My goodness,
Mm,
it's, we all think that this is going to change overnight. I'm like, little by little, just little by
mm.
little, it changes.
Yeah, that's a great
Boom.
reminder. Yeah, and like the ego again, like the mental projection, like I need it to be quick and efficient. And like, well, a part of you, yes, but still, like, how can you find safety and then allow the natural flow and rhythm of life just unfold for you and not like against you and feel and adding more resistance and pressure. So like it joins
Yeah.
just burning out, like just with social media, with everything. So, but I'm also aware of the time, so I want to respect the
Oh, it's all
time
good.
limit as well. Yeah,
Say one more thing for you for that,
yeah,
because I think
pleasure.
that's a good point. Is one of my best friends said, and I'll offer this to everybody, she was involved in the yoga world for forever. She worked in the back office though,
Okay.
of where I worked, and had seen every big teacher kind of like that you would know the name of come up through that system, and from being a practitioner to a teacher and all the way on. And she said to me, um, early on, she said, do not be the rabbit, be the tortoise.
Mm,
Slow, steady, consistent. Do what is aligned with you. Do it in the way that works for you, that really is meaningful to you, and just be consistent, because over time, the people that resonate with you will come. They will keep coming back. Don't go fast. Don't chase trend. Just do this. And she was right. And it's the best advice I ever got. And it's what I, choose to do to this day, is not to run. I'm like, slow, steady. The people that come, the people that participate, it might be one, it might be five, but guess what? If they're there and you're doing it that way, they're the dedicated, consistent people. The other ones come and go, and you got to constantly replace them.
yeah.
It's like,
And you lose
who wants
yourself in the cycle of running after students and running yourself out at the end. So yeah,
exactly? Yeah.
beautiful. Love that advice. I really appreciate it. Yeah. Yeah, that's nice. That's a great reminder. Like I just felt, like a warm hug. I'm like, yeah, yeah, go slow, like take your time and appreciating the process as well, which is yoga again. So like just savoring it, even though it's difficult sometimes, and even though it's challenging, and doubts is part of human nature as well. So just like any other emotion, so stress, anxiety, whatever is here, like how can we do self-care, and not in a very fancy manner, but really deep self-care and self-love through yoga as an entrepreneur as well. So thank you for that. Yeah, and thanks to her.
You're
Great advice.
welcome. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. She
Yeah.
gets credit for it.
We'll name her as well
Yeah,
on the
Jessica.
show. Wonderful. Thank you. Well, it's such a pleasure. I'm curious if there's anything else from silly to profound that you want to share, or if it's all beautiful for you. So,
No,
yeah,
that was awesome. I really, really enjoyed talking to you. That was a great
yeah,
conversation. So thank you for having me.
my pleasure. Thank you for being here, and thank you for everyone listening as well, or seeing the video on YouTube as well. So take well care, and we'll talk very soon too.
That's good.
Bye.